The diner was a relic of a bygone era, its neon sign flickering against the dusk of a small southern town called Willow Creek. The air inside smelled of fried onions and coffee, the kind that clung to your clothes long after you left. James Carter, a 62-year-old black veteran, pushed open the glass door, the bell above jingling faintly. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, clicked softly on the checkered floor as he made his way to a booth by the window. The diner was half empty, a few regulars nursing their plates, the hum of low conversation blending with the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. James adjusted his cap, the embroidered words, Vietnam veteran, catching the dim light. He'd been coming to Millie's diner for years, ever since he'd moved to Willow Creek after retiring from the army. It wasn't just the food, greasy spoon fare that somehow tasted like home. It was the routine, the familiarity, the way the waitresses called him sugar and refilled his coffee without asking. But tonight felt different. The air was heavier, the glances sharper. He couldn't place it, but something was off. He settled into the booth, his hands resting on the table, fingers tracing the familiar scars of his service, both the visible ones on his knuckles and the invisible ones that woke him at 3 a.m. most nights. He opened the menu, though he knew it by heart. The usual meatloaf, mashed potatoes, a side of greens, simple, comforting, a small anchor in a world that often felt adrift. The waiter approached, a young man, maybe 20, with a mop of blonde hair and a name tag that read Cody. His face was tight, lips pressed into a thin line. James offered a nod, the kind he gave everyone, a reflex from years of discipline. Cody didn't return it. "What can I get started for you?" Cody's voice was flat, his eyes fixed somewhere over James's shoulder. "Meatloaf plate, please," James said, his voice steady but warm. "Extra gravy, if you don't mind." Cody didn't write it down. Instead, he crossed his arms, his posture stiffening. "You sure you're in the right place?" he said, his tone clipped. James blinked, caught off guard. "Pardon?" I said. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Cody repeated, louder this time, his words slicing through the diner's hum. A few heads turned. The air seemed to thicken, the clatter of dishes pausing for a moment. James leaned back, his hands still on the table, steady as ever. He'd faced worse than this, far worse in jungles and on streets, in uniform and out. But the sting of those words, here, in a place he'd come to think of as his own, cut deeper than he expected. "I've been coming here for years, son," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know where I am." Cody's jaw tightened. "Well, maybe you shouldn't be. We're full up tonight." James glanced around. Half the booths were empty. A couple at the counter stared, their forks frozen mid-bite. The waitress behind the counter, Millie herself, was wiping down a coffee pot, her eyes darting between James and Cody. She didn't move. "Full up," James repeated, his voice still even, though his chest tightened. "Looks like plenty of seats to me." Cody leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I don't serve your kind here. You need to leave." The words landed like a punch, raw and deliberate. "Your kind." James felt the room shift, the edges of his vision sharpening. He'd heard those words before, decades ago, in places where signs still hung over water fountains and bus seats. But here, now, in Willow Creek, where he'd marched in the Veterans Day Parade, where he'd helped rebuild the community center after the flood. The betrayal was personal. He could have stood up, could have raised his voice, matched Cody's venom with his own. But James Carter was not that man. He'd learned long ago that anger was a fire that consumed the one who carried it. Instead, he folded his hands, looked Cody in the eye, and said, "I'm not going anywhere." Cody's face reddened, his fists clenching. "You don't get it, do you?" I said. "What's going on here?" A new voice cut through, sharp and commanding. Millie, the diner's owner, had finally stepped out from behind the counter. Her apron was stained with grease, her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was a small woman, but her presence filled the room. Cody spun toward her. "This guy's causing trouble, Millie. I told him we're full, but he won't leave." Millie's eyes flicked to James, then back to Cody. "Full, boy, we got more empty seats than a church on Monday. What's this really about?" Cody stammered, his bravado faltering. I don't think he belongs here." Millie's face hardened. "James Carter's been eating here longer than you've been alive, Cody. You don't get to decide who belongs." The diner was silent now, every eye on the scene. James sat still, his heart pounding but his face a mask of calm. He didn't want this, a spectacle, a confrontation. He just wanted his meatloaf. He wanted the world to make sense again. Millie turned to James, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, James, this ain't right. Your meal's on the house tonight." James shook his head. "I don't need charity, Millie. I just need my food." She nodded, respect in her eyes. "You'll get it. Cody, kitchen, now." Cody hesitated, his face a storm of defiance and embarrassment. He stormed off, the swinging door to the kitchen slamming behind him. Millie sat across from James, her hands clasped. "I'll handle this," she said. "He's new, young, stupid. I'll talk to him." James nodded, but the weight of Cody's words lingered. "You're kind." He'd fought for this country, bled for it, carried the ghosts of men who never came home, and yet here he was, still proving his right to exist. As Millie disappeared into the kitchen, the diner's hum returned, tentative at first, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. James stared out the window, the neon sign casting red and blue shadows across his face. He didn't know it yet, but this moment was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite something far bigger than a single night in a small town diner. The bell above the door jingled again. James didn't turn, but the air shifted once more. Footsteps approached, steady and deliberate. A man slid into the booth across from him, his suit crisp, his presence unmistakable. Mayor Harold Grayson, Willow Creek's first black mayor, leaned forward, his eyes locking onto James's. "Evening, James," the mayor said, his voice low and warm. "Heard there was some trouble. Mind if I join you?" James managed a small smile, though the ache in his chest hadn't eased. "Not at all, Mayor. Pull up a chair." Harold Grayson was not a man who entered a room unnoticed. At 55, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades proving himself in a world that often demanded twice the effort for half the recognition. His suit was tailored but not flashy. His tie a muted red that spoke of confidence rather than arrogance. As he sat across from James in the diner, the weight of his presence seemed to anchor the room, pulling every stray glance toward their booth. "Millie called me," Harold said, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "Said there was a situation. Didn't expect to find you at the center of it, James." James chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Didn't expect to be at the center of it myself." Harold leaned back, his eyes scanning the diner. The regulars had returned to their meals, but their conversations were hushed, their glances furtive. Cody was nowhere to be seen, likely still sulking in the kitchen. Millie was at the counter, her hands busy with a rag but her attention clearly on the two men. "Tell me what happened," Harold said, not as a question but as a request between old friends. James recounted the encounter, his voice measured, each word chosen with care. He didn't embellish, didn't need to. The facts were enough. Cody's refusal, the pointed words, the sting of being reduced to your kind. Harold listened, his face unreadable, though his fingers tightened around the edge of the table. When James finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his voice low. "This ain't just about you, James. This is about every one of us who's ever walked into a place like this and felt that look, that tone. You know it as well as I do." James nodded. He did know. He'd known it as a boy in Alabama, where separate but equal was a lie told with signs and fists. He'd known it in Vietnam, where the enemy's bullets didn't discriminate, but some of his own comrades did. And he knew it now in Willow Creek, where progress was real but fragile, like a seedling in rocky soil. Harold's eyes softened, but his voice held steel. "I'm not letting this slide, not in my town." "Your town," James said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Getting mighty comfortable in that mayor's chair, aren't you?" Harold grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Took me 20 years to get that chair, James. You know what it cost me. I'm not about to let some kid with a chip on his shoulder undo everything we've built." The "we" wasn't just rhetoric. James and Harold went back decades, to the days when they were both young men trying to carve out a place in a world that didn't always want them. They'd marched together in the 80s, rebuilt the community center together in the 90s, and stood shoulder to shoulder when Harold ran for mayor against a tide of opposition that wasn't always polite about its reasons. Willow Creek had come a long way, but moments like tonight were a reminder that the past was never as far away as it seemed. Millie approached, a plate of meatloaf in her hands. She set it down in front of James, her expression a mix of apology and resolve. "On the house," she said again, and this time James didn't argue. He thanked her with a nod, his appetite dulled but his gratitude real. "Cody's in the back," Millie said, glancing at Harold. "I sent him to cool off. I'll deal with him, but I don't know what got into him. He's not usually like this." Harold's gaze was steady. "People don't just wake up one day and decide to act like that, Millie. Something's been simmering. You need to find out what." She nodded, her hands twisting the rag. "I will, I promise." As Millie walked away, Harold turned back to James. "You want to press this? File a complaint. I'll back you." James shook his head. "I don't want a fight, Harold. I just want to eat my dinner in peace." Harold's jaw tightened, but he didn't push. He knew James well enough to understand that peace wasn't surrender, it was survival. James had fought enough battles for one lifetime. The diner's door jingled again, and a new figure stepped inside, Clara Thompson, the town's librarian and unofficial historian. She was a wiry woman in her 60s, with a sharp tongue and a memory that could recall every scandal Willow Creek had ever seen. She spotted James and Harold and made a beeline for their booth, her eyes blazing. "I heard what happened," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Cody's got no business working here if he's pulling that nonsense. Millie needs to fire him." "Clara," James said, his voice gentle but firm, "let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." "Bigger?" Clara's voice rose, drawing eyes again. "James, this is already big. You think this is just about one waiter. This is about what's still rotting in this town. You let this go, and it festers." Harold raised a hand, his tone calming but authoritative. "Clara, we're handling it. But we need to be smart about this, not just loud." Clara huffed but sat down, her energy crackling. The three of them, James, Harold, and Clara, were a trio bound by history, each carrying their own scars from Willow Creek's past. They talked for hours, the meatloaf growing cold as they unpacked what had happened and what it meant. The conversation wasn't just about Cody or the diner. It was about the town, its progress, and the work still left to do. By the time they left, the neon sign outside had flickered out, and the night was thick with stars. James felt the weight of the evening settle into his bones, but he also felt something else, a spark of resolve, kindled by the mayor's presence and Clara's fire. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Willow Creek Community Center was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the faint smell of polished wood. Folding chairs lined the room, occupied by a cross-section of the town, farmers in worn jeans, teachers with notepads, retirees whispering to each other, and a handful of teenagers scrolling on their phones. At the front of the room stood a podium, and behind it, Mayor Harold Grayson, his face a mask of calm determination. James Carter sat in the front row, his hands folded, his veteran's cap resting on his knee. Clara Thompson was beside him, her notebook open, her pen already scribbling. The meeting had been called in response to the incident at Millie's diner, though Harold had framed it as a community conversation. Word had spread fast in Willow Creek, as it always did, and the diner incident had become a lightning rod for deeper tensions. Some saw it as an isolated act by a foolish young man. Others saw it as a symptom of something uglier, something that had never fully left the town. Harold tapped the microphone, the feedback squealing briefly before settling. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew the eyes of a town were on him. "We're here tonight because something happened in our community that we can't ignore. Something that doesn't reflect who we are, or who we want to be." He recounted the incident, keeping James's name out of it at his friend's request. But everyone knew. The whispers had started the moment James walked into the diner that night, and they hadn't stopped. Harold didn't sugarcoat it. A black veteran, a man who'd served his country and his town, had been denied service because of the color of his skin. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd like a storm cloud. Millie stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I want to apologize," she said. "Cody's actions were wrong, and as the owner of the diner, I take responsibility. He's been let go, but I know that's not enough. I'm here to listen, and I'm here to do better." The room stirred, a mix of murmurs and nods. Some faces were sympathetic, others were skeptical. A man in the back, his baseball cap pulled low, called out, "It's just one kid, Millie. Why we making a big deal out of this?" Clara was on her feet before Harold could respond. "Because it's never just one kid," she snapped, her voice cutting through the room. "It's a kid who thought he could say what he said because he's heard it before. From family, from friends, from the internet. You don't get to that kind of hate without someone planting the seed." The man shrank back, but others nodded. The room was splitting, not along clear lines, but in the messy, human way that communities do when forced to confront their flaws. Harold raised a hand, calling for calm. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said. "It's about understanding. It's about deciding who we are as a town." James listened, his heart heavy, but his resolve firm. He hadn't wanted this. A public spectacle, a town divided. But as he looked around, he saw faces he knew. The librarian who'd helped his granddaughter with her history project. The mechanic who'd fixed his truck for free when times were tight. The pastor who'd prayed with him after his wife passed. This was his town, too, and he wasn't going to let one moment define it. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. The room fell silent. "I didn't want to be here tonight," he said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd faced worse than a crowded room. "I didn't want to make this about me, but it's not about me. It's about what we let slide. It's about what we tell our kids is okay. I fought for this country because I believed in it. I stayed in Willow Creek because I believed in it. I'm not giving up on that now." The room erupted in applause, but James didn't smile. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for the truth. The meeting stretched on, voices rising and falling, some angry, some tearful, some hopeful. Cody's name came up again and again, but so did others. Stories of slights and slurs, of moments swept under the rug. Willow Creek was airing its wounds, and it was painful but necessary. By the time the meeting ended, the town had agreed on a few things: a community training program on inclusion, a review of local businesses' hiring practices, and a public apology from Millie's Diner, to be published in the local paper. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. James left the community center with Harold and Clara, the night air cool against his skin. He felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because he wasn't carrying it alone anymore.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.